Hi, I'm Jamil Khoury. I'm the founding artistic director here at Silk Road Rising, and this is my colleague, co-writer, co-conspirator, Dr. Manal Hamzeh. Thank you. Partner in crime, and we can just kind of go on with the list. I like to say that Manal and I began a conversation, we think in the early 90s, and it has continued to this day, so it's been really extraordinary to be able to work with Manal on this project, which we actually see as the first of many that will grow out of this work of theory and scholarship. I want to start by posing a question about the major challenges in your life that compelled you to begin studying hijab and to begin thinking about Muslim women's bodies as sites of contention.
The way to answer this question, I guess, to just maybe take you all into different junctions in my life through stories. I was born in Jordan in the early 60s, so I lived through the 60s and the 70s there, a Muslim majority context, but in a family that was very progressive, not religious. I was raised in an old girls' school which mission was to prepare Arab women leaders. And I have a brother who's 2 years older than me. We were always in the streets, in the big gardens, climbing trees and playing around and competing in sports. At age 9, and I fell off my bike at my grandparents' garden, and I bled my panties, and my maternal grandmother came to me scared and started to read over me Quranic verses, trying to bless me. And that was a moment for me to begin question what my body meant in the context of being physically active in my grandparents' garden and altogether in Jordan. And I grew up in school to become a celebrated national athlete playing basketball. Comes high school, I was not offered a scholarship to go to the University of Jordan like my male peers in the national team. So that was a moment of questioning what was going on. And I didn't find answers. I go to Washington, D.C. to continue or to begin my studies, and I became a clinical educational audiologist. Came back to Jordan to work with deaf people, deaf children, hard of hearing children and their parents, fighting the justice fight in schools to bring access to those kids for education in schools and in higher education and universities. And I reached to a point at the beginning of, or in 2000, where I realized I have many questions about justice, especially in education, that I can't find answers for. So I went to do a PhD in social justice education. And that, as I took courses, I realized that my big question has to come from my body, my own embodied experiences that are related to education and access to opportunities, in particular because I was an athlete in physical education and physical activities. So I began to work or do my research with young Muslim women in the southern part of New Mexico, where I did my PhD. So I went around full circle, asking questions about my body as a young girl, and then working with deaf people who don't have access and are living injustices throughout, and then working with young Muslim women in the context of post 9/11 in the US.
Thank you. You've spoken about the complexity of negotiating your own body within multiple discourses. Can you explain to the audience what that means?
So of course I'm not, I position myself in this world through my experiences not only as a woman. I'm a woman who lived in a Muslim majority context, who's an Arab, and also queer, and now I'm an academic. I'm a woman of color in this context in the US. So many messages come to me that limit my experiences because I embody those identities. And so I have not only negotiated gendering normative discourses or messages, but I've also negotiated racializing, racist messages, even within the academy. So it is being in my body. I don't look like, of course, a woman who is visibly Muslim in the context that we live in, but I have a Muslim name, I have an accent, and I'm studying to understand Arab Muslim women in the academy. So those shape me, but also have others either judge me, block me, or perhaps engage with me and with my work. So I am not only negotiating one kind of a normative narrative about women or Muslim women, but about many things that I represent and live and have lived.
The idea of the Four Hijabs grew out of Fatima Mernissy's work. I'm just curious, is anyone here familiar with the work of the late Moroccan feminist and sociologist Fatima Mernissy? Great. So she's been a big influence on both of us. And what is it, why did you choose to apply this framework of Four Hijabs to the fieldwork that you do with young Muslim women?
Fatima Mernissy is one of many Muslim and Islamic feminists that live in the Arab Muslim majority world and otherwise in the North America too, Australia, South Africa too. But Mernissy's work was so daring because she went directly to the Quranic verses and excavated what that word hijab means and how it was co-opted, and brought out all those verses that were interpreted by patriarchal perspectives, by male scholars, and created inequities and injustices. And she gave us several tools to critically interpret those verses. One was to contextualize the revelation of those verses. How did they come to Prophet Muhammad? When and how and why? And she also, because Muslims don't depend on the Quran, the major Quran, sacred text of Quran, they depend also on the words of the Prophet, which we call the hadith. She had also excavated the hadiths that are used and circulated among Muslims, and those that are not substantiated, and we use the word authenticated, that promote more or less a patriarchal perspective and help those scholars who are patriarchs promote their interpretations of the text that is related to gender. I took what Mernissy had done and I built on it using what we call post-structural theories to expand the meaning that are possible out of those verses, depending on the context of where Muslims are living. So those meanings can be multiple, as the Muslimness of people, individuals who are Muslim can be, in the sense of, I was looking for to unpack the fixed meaning of what Muslimness means, what a Muslim can be. I did not want to just get fixed on what Muslims should be. I wanted to look for what they could be. So those theories help me expand meanings and look at the experiences of young Muslim women as multiple, dynamic, changing all the time, so that we can also not only live this life and live this world and create it as a just world, but also counter the colonialist, orientalist perspectives that stereotype Muslims, especially Muslim women, as only one kind, in their words, oppressed, confined, submissive. I wanted to show also through those theories that Muslim young women and Muslim women have agency. They've had it for centuries. They have their power of creating their own lives, creating meaning of their Muslimness throughout, depending on the context they live in. So it is building on Mernissi and other Arab Muslim feminists and taking it to a wider space to invite, through my work that is written and this film, a wider conversation, a more critical and daring conversation of what our bodies mean, Muslim or not, when we negotiate powerful narratives that confine our lives.
So if we are to read on our own the 16 Quranic verses that correspond to the Four Hijabs, how are you asking us to read them?
I'm taking this opportunity as a teaching moment, of course, for me, because I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, and hopefully you can see the film over and over again when we put it online. If you read my work that is online beside the book, and Mernissi's work, to begin to grapple with all those the text that seems complex, but it's not if you begin to use tools like contextualizing it, tools of being critical with an eye on gender justice. I've heard mothers who are Muslims who negotiate that with their daughters, of like, what does this mean to you in the Quran? And the mother should be always looking to help their kids think about this interpretation to mean that there are no limits to their ambitions, achievements in this world because they're Muslims. So they should read the Quran with that kind of goal in mind, to expand their Muslimness and not to have it being dictated on them by others or authorities that who should not be questioned.
And as a scholar and an activist, what are your hopes for this film, for this project?
First of all, this project and the team that put so much effort into this and bringing it to the wider audience, beside the academic audience and the teaching audience, is that ultimately, I don't want to be timid about this. I don't want to hear again the question that we heard in the film, that should we put that kind of cover on Muslim women's bodies or not? That is not our business. I want this film to open a conversation that has no limits to how we read the Quranic text in many ways in different contexts. So I'm hoping to widen the conversation and to begin with that, not only expand our presence in this world, but also to counter the very humiliating, stereotypical narrative from the colonial West about Muslims and Muslim women in particular.
And those who subscribe to a binary of to veil or not to veil, what do you say?
I say to them, put that question aside, take time to get into the complexities of the ideas that we're presenting here, and then we'll see where it takes you. I'm not forcing you to do anything, but what we're beginning today in this space is a process that is necessary, urgent, and that has been shut off for centuries, and more shut off here in the context after 9/11.
And I just want to add, as Manal's collaborator and a non-Muslim man and an ally, it's been very important to me personally throughout this process that we not take a position, quote unquote, on the hijab, that this not be about pro or con, that this really be a way of creating space for the very broad, open, sort of fluid in many respects conversation that Manal is asking for. At this point in the program, I want to turn to our three distinguished responders who have agreed to each share their own thoughts about the film with us. They will each speak for about 5 minutes. And I want to begin with Itedal Shalabi. So.
I need a mic, even though I raised 3 boys, but I still think I need a mic. Right? All right. They've asked us 3 questions, and what does hijab mean to me? And for me, I'd have to take you with me on a story as well. I wore hijab at age 17. No one forced me to at that time. No one asked me to. It wasn't something that my parents had expected. But when I came home wearing it, they welcomed it and they loved it. At age about 23, 22, I began to question, what does it mean to wear a hijab? And I took it off. And then at age 31, going to be almost 32, I lost my husband in a bad car accident. And so for me, it was a mourning period, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll put it on for the mourning period. And then after 4 months, I'll take it off and things will go back to what it was, right? And so I went back to work a couple of weeks later, and all of a sudden, imagine, being a Muslim woman, an Arab woman, a Palestinian. I just lost my husband, and I'm raising my 3 boys, and this question of what are you doing? And a lot of issues had come up. But what hijab meant to me at that time was I'm wearing it for a mourning period. I didn't believe that a Muslim woman wearing the veil is better than a Muslim woman that's not wearing a veil. That was not a question that I have ever entertained. I believed it's what our actions dictate to us and what you do in life. But I wore it out of respect. But when I started working in mainstream and I went back to my job, I started having people talk to me slower and louder. And I'm not stupid or deaf. I started going to meetings and people asking, does she speak English? How'd she get here? And for me, it was so enlightening and so empowering and brought me such dignified that it really made me, which it is part of me now. It is part of me and it still continues to be a challenge. If anyone tells you for the past 2 weeks when it was 90 degree, 95 degree that it wasn't hot under there, believe me, it's hot under here. All right? Even though the verses, I didn't know there was 16 verses. So that was a surprise from this lovely film that we've just seen. So I'm interested in getting those 16 verses because I'd like to debate them even more. But I also witnessed a lot of the youth and a lot of our women who began to question, what am I doing? What am I wearing? What is the reason for wearing it? And that really began for us as Muslim women is to entertain that question more so than anyone else, because after 9/11, I've had many people walk up to me on the streets and say, honey, sweetheart, you're an American now, take it off. But I love it. It is part of me. It is my identity. It is part of my identity. And so for me, it has become an acceptance. 9/11 came, and my mom called from overseas and she says, Mom, it's okay if you take it off. They're attacking Muslim women on the streets, you're working, you have to do what you have to do. And I said, Mom, can we ask an African American to take their skin color off? This isn't just something that I'm going through. This is something that we as a society need to come to terms with. And we need to put our best foot forward. I've had the FBI come after my 8-year-old son at that time. I've had the community tell me that's because you're outspoken. I've had others come and say, why are you opening an office? I run a social service organization where we don't shy away from tough subjects within our Muslim community, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's child abuse, whether it's elder abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's women who are selling themselves to pay their rent, and who am I going to judge them because they have to do what they have to do? So these are questions that engulfs us. And I had to educate myself, not be educated by others, of what does Islam mean? And who dictates Islam? Is it the patriarchal society that we need to lead, or is it we as Muslim women that need to redesign it and reshape it and reinterpret it? And I think that's what the Manals of the world, and I applaud you, that are helping us to question and to redefine Islam for who we are as Muslim women within the context of living in the United States. Not living in Morocco, not living in Egypt, not living in Jordan, but for us, what does it mean here? And so for me, the movie really reaffirms my love for my Islam. It is part of who I am. I sit on the committees now. I sit with the governor's committees. I'm down in Springfield advocating for social change. I'm running an office that's $1 million office that has 26 staff that is reshaping who we are as Arab and Muslims, and we're doing it as women. We're doing it with our Islamic values, but it's not in your face Islam. This is part of who we are. And so for me, the hijab has come to be part of who I am, and will always be there for me as who I am.
Well, I would now like to call to the stage Fouad Teymour.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be invited here to respond to this wonderful movie we just saw. I'm an academician, but neither in theology nor in social sciences. I'm also a playwright, a Muslim, an Egyptian American, and an all-around good guy. As an artist, I like to explore the things that limit the human experience. So I ventured in different things. I wrote a play recently that deals directly with issues of women's rights in Islam. And I like to believe that maybe this is one of the reasons that I was invited, because Jamil read that, and maybe that was one of the reasons to invite me to hear my perspective. The one other thing is, I'm a man. I'm the only man that is on that panel outside of our screenplay writer. So, and why does that make a difference? A couple of weeks ago, I was here for another event, and I ran into Jamil, and in his very subtle ways, he said to me, he said, you know, Fouad, I'm looking forward to your participation in this, and you know you're carrying the burden of speaking for 500 million Muslim men. Maybe no pressure. That's the no pressure from Jamil. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody. I'm speaking on behalf of only myself. And I bring up the issue of man because I have a friend. She's a hijabi. She's a chic hijabi. Very fashionable, colorful hijabs all the time. And the issue of hijab comes up a lot in conversations that we have when we have groups of Egyptian American friends talking. And one time in one of those, I'm not the bashful type, I do express my opinion. So she said to me, she said, I want to know, asked me the question, why is it that when the issue of hijab comes up, it's always a man that brings it up? She asked that question. And I debated with her what I thought about it and all of that. But I kept thinking about that later on. And I found that there is some credibility to what she's saying, even though I also reject it. And the credibility comes from, you know, let me try to explain that to you. I think most of you here, a lot of you think of yourselves as progressives. You get very upset when injustice happens, when things are, and you want to talk about it. And sometimes it's happening to other people, not you. And you express yourself, and it's not received the way you thought it would be received. So just this week, Bill Clinton tried to be very supportive of the Muslim society, and there are lots of Muslim leaders that got furious and called him out and said this is white privilege, and they really called him on it. It didn't bother me, but it bothered some people. When the things happened in Baton Rouge and in Minneapolis in the same week, a lot of us were talking. One of the radio show hosts in Chicago, can't remember his name, he came on and he said, at the top of his program, he said, why is it that whenever something happens in the black community, we white people feel that we have to say something, that we have to speak up? And he said, today, I'm not going to speak. I'm going to open up the mic and I'll just listen. And only African American callers are allowed to talk because he wanted to listen from inside that community. So there is that part, you know. But at the same time, I feel that as a man, because there was a heavy patriarchy in imposing the hijabs, I think we also have a role in talking against it and having people who are vocal against the hijab. And I'm so happy to see that the movie presents that same idea, that it is an issue that men and women can chime in on. So my position, my personal position is, if a woman wants to wear the hijab, it's her right. If she doesn't want to wear the hijab, it's her right. It's nobody's business to decide that for them. But I'm very opposed on people who dictate that a woman must wear the hijab or a woman should not wear the hijab, and especially when that comes from the male perspective. So that was mostly about the visual hijab. About the Four Hijabs, I've been involved in this project for a couple of years now, and I've learned a lot from that. When we were growing up, we knew about the visual hijab. If you were better educated, you probably knew about the spatial hijab, but the rest of it, never thought about it, never came to our mind at all. So what I find very, very educational about this, and thought-provoking, is the idea of the spiritual hijab that needs to be overcome. As I told you, I've written a play about issues that are related to that. A few months ago, when I was done with it, I sent it to a few people to read it. The first person to read it was Manal. And then she read it the same day. I sent it to her, sent me back her response, and I want to share with you some of what she said. I just want to make sure I quote her correctly. She says the women, and she means the women in this play, are constantly negotiating the limitations of the normative interpretations of these hijabs. They are constantly negotiating the limitations of the normative interpretation of these hijabs. That is, they are crossing or trying to cross the spiritual hijab in search of gender justice. Okay, so that is really, to me, reading this was eye-opening. I share it with you because I wanted you to know that I have been personally inspired by this project of the Four Hijabs. I'm also flattered that Manal is saying this about the women in the play, but she really is talking about women in general, in the real life. They are constantly negotiating the limitations of the normative interpretations of these hijabs. The idea of the spiritual hijab and how to overcome it, and how to allow our minds to be able to talk and think and not, shy away from discussing any specific point, right? So to me, the takeaway message from this is let's talk some more, let's overcome the spiritual hijab. That moment in the play, in the film where it says that is very powerful. But instead of actually doing this as a society, we did the opposite. We actually started, we have these four hijabs that are documented in the scripture. We started inventing more hijabs. You know, think about the fifth hijab, the hijab of driving in a country that shall remain nameless. But you know, it's not visual because women put on the hijab before they get into the car. It's not spatial because they're allowed to ride in cars, but only not in the driver's seat. But it's a hijab against driving. And it's not just limited to Islam, it's everywhere. We have hijabs that are doing a hijab based on skin color, based on race, based on sexuality, based on opinion, based on everything. They have hijabs about the telephone, about the television, about everything is being put in a hijab. So I really applaud this effort, and I hope that, like Manal was saying, that we will open up our minds and talk more and more and more, and not focus on this is what should happen and this is not what should happen. Just continue discussing until everybody has the agency to decide for themselves. Thank you very much.
And now I would like to call Suroor Raheemullah to our stage.
So I want to first start off by thanking Jamil, Malik, Manal, Dr. Manal, Elizabeth, and Anna as well for inviting me to be a part of this discussion on a very important topic and one that is dear to me. I'm going to share with you some of the reflections as I saw this, the filming, and a lot of it is there's going to be some personal kind of interplay in there as well. Number one, something that really stood out strong to me and I thought was very impactful was the multiracial family. Mm-hmm. I think it may not have been the core focus of the film, but I presume it was very intentional and strategic on the part of the writers and the entire team. And I call that out because I think in a lot of the time, things that we're seeing, it's really important, the subliminal messages that we're sending out within our community, within broader communities, to see something like that and constantly reiterate the universality that is Islam, because it covers multiple ethnicities, multiple races, multiple different things. And so for that, I really want to commend the team in doing that. Another reflection that I had, I didn't know Dr. Manal or her work. So unlike Fouad and Itedal, who knew her more, I really felt like I needed to understand a little bit more. So I bought her book, and I started reading it, because I wanted to get a little bit of a perspective of what to expect, to be honest. And I think what was really profound for me was thinking about hijab and thinking about these 16 verses in a non-gender lens perspective. Growing up, I didn't always wear the scarf. But growing up, you could show me a card that had a hijab, right away in my mind would be a woman. Always. Honestly, even until now. And so I thought what was really profound is that 10 of the 16, and she goes into this a little bit more in the book, 10 of the 16 are talking about spiritual hijab and this, how do you get closer to your creator, which has absolutely no gender lens at all. And for me, I needed to let that sink in a little bit, to just let it sit. Because that's pretty profound in how we reframe the narrative around what this really means. And so that for me was something that I hadn't thought of it that way. I had known some of these verses, and I understood the meanings behind them, but it was really helping to kind of bring it together for me. What this film also did for me was a little bit of a trigger. It started making me think about experiences I had throughout my life. As I mentioned, part of my life I did not wear a scarf, part of my life I have. And I started to think about those experiences, and some of them were kind of from these values of misogyny, to be honest. And started thinking about the otherizing that sometimes happens within any community, to be honest. But also this feeling like second-class citizens sometimes, and otherizing women or kind of cascading women into this different light. And it made me really think about some of those experiences that I've had, and how they framed me, and how they make me passionate for the work that I'm doing with the organization that I'm part of. But it also made me reflect, because when I saw in the film, there was a little bit of this anti-scholar, teacher kind of sentiment, as well as this sort of like bearded men comment. And I thought to myself, that behavior that I experienced was rooted in oppressive behavior. But are we doing the same thing to that group of people by having that same type of behavior? And it's a question. It's a question I'd love to explore and talk more about. But I wonder, when we think about impacting change and changing the narrative, is doing unto others what they've been doing unto us for years the most impactful way to do it? And it's a question. I'd love to talk about it more, but it's one that I think really sat with me, and probably a lot because a lot of the work that we do in our organization is around gender equity and making movement and having difficult conversations and pushing the momentum forward. And then lastly, I'm so grateful to this team to give me the opportunity to kind of walk outside of life and reflect. Because they asked us to share, what does hijab mean to me? And I don't think I've done that in a really long time, right? You get caught up in things, and it's been a long time since I started wearing this scarf. And so for me, I understand it to be a command, not one that someone has forced me into or bullied me into, one that I chose, like I choose every path that I take, with research, with credibility, with confidence. And I think about the experiences that I've had both before wearing the scarf and after wearing the scarf. And there's two kind of groups of people that I think can be very problematic, equally problematic. One is the group who wears veils, covers, scarves, and looks at the other and otherizes them, or makes them feel less than, or not good enough. And that's just wrong. But then there's the other group who tries to devalue it by so much, like that it's really nothing at all, or tries to erase the existence of the command. And I think that can be problematic as well. So there's got to be a balance when it comes, when we think about the groups. But at the end of the day, it's about what are we projecting on other people, whatever your beliefs are. It's about coming together, not separating. And so that was really interesting for me to kind of reflect. And then when I think about the time that we're in, and the rising Islamophobia that's out there, and the anti-Muslim sentiment, I've realized, and kind of watching this film made me realize, that hijab is a tool. It has the ability to dispel myths. It has the ability to inform for those who have been misinformed by people. And it truly has the ability that it's a tool that can be used to change the hearts and minds of people. I don't get to be an incognito Muslim. And I say that meaning, when I go to the grocery store, and if my husband goes to the grocery store, I don't get to just like fly under the radar. People are watching me. People are judging me. And what's a simple walk through the grocery line could be a teachable moment. And so I see it as power, as a powerful way to impact perspectives and to really get into people's hearts. And that, to me, is ultimate empowerment. Thank you.
Really, at this time, you've heard a lot from us and from and seen the piece twice. We'd love to start hearing your thoughts, and both about the content and also an artistic process. I think Anna and Liz did just really beautiful work on bringing this to life, and this has been a real journey in that we took the theories, the scholarship of Manal, and kept working on how do we adapt this, how do we sort of cull this language into an accessible piece of art. And so the questions can be as broad as you like and really speak to, once again, subject matter as well as process. Yes?
I want to thank you for the film. I really liked the categorization of the four types of hijab and the primacy of the spiritual hijab. Because I agree, I think that gets ignored a lot, and that's such a huge part of Muslim spiritual existence. But at the same time, I think what really gave me pause is the distancing of existing scholarship on these issues. Scholarship is a conversation. It's not a closed door. That door has never been closed. It should remain open. But I don't think you can just ignore what centuries of Muslim scholars have written and understood the topic to be, because each age understood it differently, and it's our responsibility to add to that conversation. But to say that we can just do it individually, irrespective of what's been said before, leads us down a different path sometimes. And it's not by accident that we have phenomena like ISIS. And yes. Because that's exactly what they do. They read it independently, irrespective of existing scholarship, how people, Muslim scholars, and scholarship is open to anybody if you want to go down that route and become trained, to become mujtahid. But my personal reading is my personal reading. it speaks to me. So when I read the Quran, that's my reading of the Quran. I cannot then take my reading of the Quran and foist it on other people around me. And I think this question of authority, of who gets to interpret Islam, is an important one. And I wish it was discussed a bit, like even a couple of lines, or somehow acknowledged. But what I've walked away from here is saying, oh, we could dismiss all of that and we could just read it ourselves and come up with our own understanding, which is fine, but then that's my understanding. And that's why I say that, you know, scholarship is a conversation, and we have each generation needs to add their voice, their understanding, and perhaps there's something of benefit that we could take from our, you know, predecessors, and there's some things that no one's really specific to this context that makes no sense here in America or in Morocco. In each context, like, you know, you can have a time and scholars in, you know, Mali interpreted it very different from scholars in China, because it's those times that those places were different. And I think understanding that and unraveling those layers, that's a responsibility we have, and then it becomes very dynamic and diverse, and not just, well, you know, it's whatever I think it is. Yeah.
I honor your perspective.
It was really well presented. It's just kind of simple, but laying out the four hijabs, I thought that was pretty brilliant. But I think, again, it's more of a discussion piece than anything. That's all I'm going to say.
We really see this as kind of a prompting piece, if you will, that you will pursue that, you know, further inquiry, questioning, study. So it's about essentially posing questions. I mean, presenting this idea and encouraging us as lay people, as interested parties somehow, to learn more. Yeah, let me just...
Hi, comment and then a question. Comment, as a biracial person, I really like the inclusion as just a little thing to add to it. I really like that part. And also a question, what was the process of taking this from just an idea of wanting to share this information to like a finished, developed project?
So I think Jamil and Manal spoke briefly about their long history together, and it was about 1.5 years ago that we finally were sitting down and having conversations about what it would start to look like if we were to approach it as an animation. And so Anna Hayden-Roy was a former student of mine, was just graduating at that point, and was really interested in doing more animation. So we quickly wrote her in and started talking about what does it mean to visualize hijabs. And I think that was one of the things that was really both a challenge and something that we learned a lot from. Manal kept pushing back on us to say, don't make the hijabs into people, make them use art and abstraction to get across a point. And then the voice actors, we brought them in very early too. So essentially the whole team was engaged in looking at the script and helping to think through how to tweak words or rewrite parts of it. And then we had a series of, I think we did the voice actors 2 times before we recorded. Is that right?
There were a series of workshops.
Leading up to the actual voice recording. And then once we had that, the script was nailed down, and we could then start really storyboarding. And Anna, I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about the storyboarding.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that so many components came together for this project before I even penned to paper, really. I mean, I came in initially with some very sort of loose, broad concept art that then almost immediately sort of metamorphosized into something that was really profoundly different from what we started out with. And so I think for me as an artist, this was the most conversational piece of work I've ever been a part of, in that I came in as, I hope, a conduit for this conversation to bring it to life in a way that wasn't solely a product of my own imagination, but a product of a conversation that took place over a series of many months. And I think that yeah, in that sense, it was a very interesting project artistically, and I hope that what we have here reflects that conversation, and that it's not the product of any one single person, it's the product of many, many minds coming together to create something that I myself am very proud of.
Go in the back. And then we'll come in. Yes.
I understood the concept. I didn't understand the symbol that was
The
used.
symbol. I'm sorry. Okay. Symbol.
How it related to ethical.
Yeah, so that was the most challenging hijab to create an identity for in some sense, and maybe that has to do with ethics. How do you represent ethics in a way that's not too embedded in a particular culture? And so we started working with geometric shapes, and then also had to stay away from particular geometric shapes, like the pyramid. So it was a lot of playing until we found something that was both, I think, more three-dimensional than spatial could be, for example, and also had an ability to have a kind of mouth-like structures because ethical ended up talking the most. I think ethical has the most lines. And then we started looking at Islamic art, particularly in mosques and architecture, to think about how ethical could, at the very beginning you see ethical spiral into a color pattern. So just drawing upon very lightly the history of architecture.
Yeah, and to add my own piece to that, I kept sort of circling around to, I think at the very beginning that stated that ethical is a threshold, and I wanted to sort of incorporate an element of that, the threshold, that it's a, you never see inside of it, and that's, I guess that perhaps represents, the ethical threshold that we each individually have to pass through, and that dark space kind of hopefully represents that ethics for each individual person might look a little bit different once you sort of pass through.
Yes, in the back.
First, I love it. Thank all of you. I also want to say that some of the conversational questions stimulated in my mind are actually about Islam, and that I'll ask one in a minute. But that leads me also to ask what audiences you all had in mind. So I'll give you my question about Islam. What is I think the right word is authority, or some people may say, is it in the Quran that we do have, as faithful individuals, the command or the right or the whatever that is, to identify and choose how we believe and how we interpret?
So, obviously, we believe that the most immediate audience for the piece are Muslim women, frankly, and Muslims in general, for whom these questions and these issues have an immediacy and a very specific set of meanings. But we are also hoping that this piece is engaged well beyond Muslim audiences, and in part because these ideas are not foreign or alien to most world religions, and questions of modesty and behavior and ethics and attainment of knowledge and so forth, run throughout all of our traditions in any number of ways. So there is both a specificity and a universality to the piece, we hope. That's always, an objective. But we assume that when this is living online, and we're also going to do a lot to promote it, virtually and so forth, that Muslim audiences or Muslim individuals will probably be the most receptive. We're also going to do a lot of sort of targeted marketing of the piece and presentations to community groups, faith communities, so forth. And I think it also has relevance to women's studies, gender studies, people who study social justice, people who study the interpretation of sacred texts, how we engage sacred texts. So I want to believe that there are many audiences for this piece, and that there is potentially a very large audience for this piece. And obviously different people are going to engage it through any number of different lenses. If you wanted to.
So the second part of the question I'll address very briefly in relation to the work I have done and in relation to this film. the 10 verses about the spiritual hijab are the call in Islam to peel covers over deeper knowledge. So to get to deeper knowledge, we have to question. Simply questioning authority in the sense of meanings that are fixed, that are taken for granted, that are hidden, that stand in our way of becoming more spiritual, more knowledgeable. And there are many people here who can speak on to that question from another perspective also.
So I have a question about kind of carrying up on that, the universality versus the specific of the audience. I belong to a group called the Daughters of Abraham, and it's a book group that was started in Boston after 9/11 for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women to get together and actually build bridges and have conversations. So, and I'm thinking, wow, this is like perfect for our group. I want to show this film. I want to have discussions. And I was wondering, like, what is, as a Jewish woman, as a Buddhist woman, what is my job? Like, those are questions. But my concern is, does it water down? Does it take away from the discussion? And you're smiling. I'm just curious, like, I'm in a white privileged way, and maybe I'm not being, but in a way trying to be sensitive, or my intent is to want to be a part of the conversation, but also not dominate the conversation. And I have privileges that I may not be aware of, or that even though my intent is to not do that, in doing that, bringing it to my group, am I doing that?
We're hoping, as Jamil said, to use this film as a prompter in the classroom, in dialogue circles, but also to supplement it with many other sources. Not only my book, and I'm not trying to promote my book, but also Marnice's work and many other Muslim feminist scholars like Amina Wadud, who specifically does her work on Quranic text. So you have many, many other sources that are also listed in the references of my book, which we should provide on the website for those who want to create teaching, learning circles on this matter. So this is just a little piece that took us about 18 months to finish. And with a lot of money that Silk Road Rising had to raise just to begin this conversation.
Can I add that at the end of the day, engaging in the conversation, even when you're engaged with Muslims, we're not all on the same page ourselves. Yes. And so there's different views and different viewpoints. So if you're in a group, or if you're talking to your neighbor, if you're talking to your, a student or whoever, we're not all on the same page with what it means. And that's the beauty of Islam, is to continuously challenge and continuously question. And what each of us comes to a conclusion is good for us, because at the end of the day, as Muslims, we believe we're going to stand in front of Allah and answer to ourselves. And I can't say, well, I followed this scholar who said I have to do this and this and this. Allah's going to say, why didn't you read it for yourself? Right. And so that's the ijtihad, and that's what you're questioning. That's what you're, nobody's, not saying that the scholars don't have a point, but it shouldn't be one way. Sunni Islam, we have 4 schools of thought. You have the Shiites who believe in different ways. You have the Ahmadiyyas. So when you become, it's like different denominations within Christianity and Judaism. And so who's right and who's wrong is not the question. It's the dialogue that needs, and I appreciate the dialogue, and I appreciate that we're trying to look at Islam and look at hijab from a different lens, and it is about women redefining it for themselves.
Sort of building on something we were saying earlier, there's this space for looking at how this relates to your own tradition, how this relates to your own upbringing, the messaging around questions of gender and space and behavior and ethics. That were part of your own socialization process. So in our early conversations, everything Manal would be telling me, I would be translating into the context of the faith tradition I was raised in Orthodox Christianity, because there were so many very immediate, accessible parallels. And these hijabs in different ways and shapes and forms very much exist in the tradition that I was raised in, and any number of other traditions. So I think, not to overstate that case, I just think that there's something that speaks to all of us.
Congratulations! It's a wonderfully artistic and exquisitely put together piece of art. So thank you. My question builds on an earlier question. Historically speaking, how many centuries of scholarship were the exclusive domain of men? And when did women become involved in the shall we say, official scholarship around the Quran?
Of course, I have an answer to that, but we have a specialist who can speak on this in the crowd. So maybe we can pull on our Azhari colleague to answer that question, and then I'll add my feminist perspective on it.
Started in the Prophet's time, when his wives even challenged him to some issues. So it never stopped. Women have been vocal, expressing their opinions, but it was the demise of men that they kind of tried to suppress women's voice. But the heritage of Islam, the books of the second source of Islam, which is books of hadith, many prophets saying and narratives about his acts and actions in life were told by women. So the reference was women. There is a 3-volume, big volume work on women in the time of the Prophet, and that work has not been really utilized well in the scholarship of people writing about Islam. Was this a conspiracy? Maybe, but also I think it was out of fear of those men scholars to get women in the front row and they'll be driving them. But women in Islam have been contributing a lot to scholarship in Islam. It is time now to get them out. Thank you.
I have one last thing to give you. I just want a raise of hands in the audience to tell me how many of you started to think of the word hijab, which is not mentioned in the 2 verses about the visual dimension of the veil. How many of you had started to think of the hijab as other hijabs, spatial, ethical, and spiritual, after this film? Right, and so, if that is the case, majority of you did, have you noticed that also we focus so much on the dress, the modest dress, much more than I would have wished for?
In the conversation.
I'm leaving you with this wish, is to open the conversation about the questioning and the understanding of the spiritual hijab, which has the most verses in the Quran, the call for DeVeiling, the unpacking of multiple meanings of all the texts, the Quranic texts, and not to be focused on the bodies of women, whatever they want to do with their bodies, whether they are Muslim or not Muslim. And thank you for attending. Thank you.